Now, something you and Whittaker disagree on is the question of whether Blake was a pacifist. But as well as answering that question, was Blake a pacifist? I'd also like you to comment on this: that the later Blake says that talks about Homer, Ovid, Plato, and Cicero as being stolen and perverted writings, and the point is that Whittaker argues that Blake's criticism of this classical tradition, this ancient classical tradition, is a pacifist criticism.
Mm.
So I was surprised. I mean, fair, Plato's fair game, but I'm surprised anyone could criticize Homer, and I'm not sure how deeply felt it that was.
That's right. Yeah, I think there's two different things going on here. One is the argument about Blake's politics, and we should separate that from these
Yeah,
arguments of the Greeks. When he does basically say classical culture is basically bullshit, and it's all stolen from the Hebrews and the great civilizations of the Middle East and Near East and things like that. Principally, the Jews and the Egyptians and important people like that, not these puny little Dorians and whatever. I used to think this stuff was completely crazy when I first used to read it in Blake. But of course, the more you understand about that epoch, particularly in sort of deeper history, sometime before Plato, back into the Mycenaean period, back to Troy, but of course these areas was completely interwoven with each other. The idea that there was the Greek nation before there was a Greek nation, all these things were highly integrated. So it's actually kind of his general argument that the Greeks owe a lot more to the Hebrews than you would suppose is probably a decent argument. But making out that the Greeks and the Romans are responsible, that they're silly slaves of the sword, as Blake puts it, I think that makes a lot more sense once you realise that what he's doing, it's like a prototype version of Adorno and Horkheimer's dialectic of enlightenment. It's the Enlightenment that he's criticising with its love of classical simplicity, elegance, and pure form. And so what he's saying in a loose way is that this modern worship of classicism is connected with the mechanical, rationalistic, however you want to put it, thinking that binds us in war. And in a sense, I'm agreeing with him in my main conclusions in saying that patriotism, in a sense, one of the things I want to say is that patriotism is part of a system of obligations that do tie you into a network of inclusions, identifications, exclusions that eventually, fuel war and conflict and so on. So to some extent, I agree with him. Whether it's fair to put all that on the Greeks and the Romans is from the point of view of this argument, is a matter of detail. And Blake hadn't always thought that. Whittaker's very clear that this is a position that Blake arrived at in later life, pinning it on classicism. But you can bracket that bit if you can see that his point is to attack the modern attitudes in as much as they're rooted in classicism is how he would be thinking about it.
and on the pacifism, you have support from a fantastic direction, unexpected direction, I think, for many people listening, perhaps. Georges Bataille had a comment on Tiger. He says, "Never have eyes as wide open as Blake's stared at the sun of cruelty, and that Blake's mind was open to the truth of evil." And you use that quote to argue that Blake cannot really be read as a sort of modern pacifist. Poems like Tiger are.
I don't think it's fruitful to see him in the modern sense as someone opposed to war. I mean, this becomes a wider argument later on when I pick up, what I call the author's dialectics without negation, that issue. But the sort of the author's own antagonism, towards conflict, negation, whatever. He sees this as essentially Blake to dampen down conflict and remove it. So the essence, so how he interprets the introductory paragraphs, which talk about Ovid, Homer, and Plato, and so on, and calls them silly slaves of the sword, he takes that to mean that, their rationalism tends towards violence, and if you don't want violence, you have to be against violence and rationalism, something like that. Now, I don't see how it follows, really. I can see, the way I put it is that, first of all, yes, Blake says that they're silly slaves of the sword. That doesn't mean that he himself is an enemy of the sword. He just doesn't want to be a slave to it. There's an analogous argument in Buddhism. The Buddha is against violence. It doesn't make him a pacifist. There might be, times at which you have to use violence in order to minimize violence, as crazy as that sounds to the sort of, the pure pacifist. But, the world is crazy and complicated. So it's at least conceivable that you can oppose these systems of rapine and violence and the kind of logic that leads to eternal war. It's possible that you can reject that logic and still not become a pacifist. And to put it simply, Blake was a very punchy kind of person. This is, for a pacifist, not many pacifists have been in court on trial for their life for violently assaulting a British soldier. He's someone who celebrated the French Revolution. Everybody knows that, with the excesses, as they say, of the revolution, later on, he turned away from it somewhat, or was somewhat disappointed, as were many romantics, of course, Wordsworth and Coleridge famously, but, the lot of them, really. That doesn't mean that Blake was always against violence, or that he believed that in the early stages of the revolution they'd been able somehow to do without any violence. He's quite. So I just think it's an oversimplification and I'd rather have seen a political analysis and a closer look at Blake's actual positions over the years to try and extract from that his attitude towards violence. I'd rather that than what actually happens, which is that in some sense Blake is just seen as pacifistic, and it's done in such a way that you can later on basically call anybody who shies away from, the full-blooded belligerence and a warlike attitude, anyone who falls short of that can be seen by the author as somewhat Blakean in some sense, because they're less violent. So it all seems a bit vague to me in general. And then in the specifics, it strikes me as worth mentioning that while Blake describes the Greeks and Romans as silly slaves of the sword in the preface, then in the main body of what becomes the hymn, we see, give me my sword. He asks for his sword to be passed to him. Now, which way is it to be? Is he for or against swords? And I think the simple pacifist answer has trouble with the sword, because later on,
and it kind of ruins the poem, because the poem reads better if you are going to fight for Jerusalem. Bring me my sword, bring me my chariot. Let's do this. And that's what people love about the poem. Whether you're on the right or the left, it still gives you goosebumps, because it's about not being, pacifist, and it's really about achieving something magnificent. You can disagree on what the magnificent thing is, whether it should be England or not. But
so what Professor Whittaker argues is that you do carry on with conflict, but it becomes non-negative. There's no negation. That's why I call his work a dialectics without negation. It's a sort of non-antagonistic dialectics. So what he argues for is the contraries. So he uses quotes from Blake, where Blake talks about contraries which can coexist, love and hate, and so on. But he defines them in opposition to negations, which are destructive. They cannot coexist. A negation is simply destructive. And Whittaker takes that terminology and turns it into an argument for a sort of, again, a non-antagonistic dialectics, which is basically debate. Debate replaces war. George or not war. And this, as a political project, is something anybody can recognise. It's a nice person saying, "Wouldn't it be nice if we talk things through rather than fought?" That's, you know, as a sort of general attitude, it's an understandable attitude, but it's not Blake's politics. And I think it would be surprising if, you know, Blake the Great Radical essentially issued in saying, well, you know, there's two things. It would be surprising to me if the great, you know, the combative, more than controversialist Blake simply ended up saying that everything should just be a discussion. But more than that, if you're arguing that, you know, that Ovid, Homer, Plato, etc., were silly slaves of the sword, if your solution is debate, well, aren't they the people who invented that? Isn't that what the Socratic dialectic is? That we talk and we talk and we asymptotically, you know, we converge on the truth through this dialect. Why reject the Greeks, since that's actually what they invented? You know, Socrates, that's what Socrates is basically about. So I don't see how you can argue that Blake saw in the Greeks and the Romans, you know, the silly slaves of the sword, and that the answer to that was academic debate, as in the academy, as in Socrates, you know, because that is what is on offer as an interpretation of Blake, is very Greek.
And I think you make a really persuasive point, at least to me, but then perhaps I'm biased, on the question of Blake's dialectics, because you point out that there was the zeitgeist of Blake's era is that of sort of pre-Hegel and Boehm, so that it's sort of in the air, and and therefore the Whittaker position of trying to draw a distinction between negation and contradiction, that's a sort of modern construction, but in Blake's time, and Blake himself doesn't seem to have had that made that distinction. That for him, negation is everything. I mean, it's the grit that allows motion to happen.
It's very, I mean, obviously a lot of research needs to be done, you know, to try and pin some of these things down. But you know, my sense of when I read Blake, for example, in The Marriage of Heaven and Hell, where he talks about contraries and negations and energy and reason as being contrary to one another, you know, I do hear Jacob Boehm, the 16th century, well, according to Hegel, the first German philosopher, but a cobbler, not unlike Deitchkin later on. But anyway, a cobbler who wrote extensively on theology, but his central insight seems to be about this kind of the monistic nature of God, or the two sides of God, how they're so interrelated. And, you know, he talks about, well, I won't say what he talks about in Boehm, just I'll simply say that my feeling is that the mood there, when talking about negation and essentially dialectical progress, is very much the mood I find in The Marriage of Heaven and Hell. And, you know, when you look at the romantic poets of Blake's era, including Blake, you know, behind it all, there is a connection with German idealist philosophy. You know, certainly very explicitly so with Coleridge, but also with people around Blake, you know, who really knew about this stuff, I think, some of them, and were interested in it. And what I find is that the productive philosophical engagement with that tradition of Boehm really takes place for me in Hegel, and Hegel's idea of negation and, again, dialectic and sublation and annihilation and all of these quite technical terms. You know, it's very easy to get into a technical discussion. But let me say that really at the essence of it is this notion that negation isn't a purely negative thing.
Right.
And it seems to me that Whittaker wants to defang the dialectic and remove painful bits of it, the actual negation, and argue that instead we're all united, non-antagonistically, all of us in Albion. We are the giant Albion. And that's why, if we only realize that, then we could progress through debate and discussion, and the nations could debate with one another. And it just seems to me, quite apart from anything else, as they're those politics are quite well known. They're middle of the road, social democratic, vaguely liberal with a small L type politics. So it seems odd to sort of announce.
I'll come to that, but just before we move off the dialectics, then. So I was persuaded, and I think I was most persuaded by the Adorno quote, which you give, which is Adorno would go so far as to say, to have any thought at all requires negation. You have to have a separation to even begin to understand what you're facing. You know, the subject object.
The object in front of it.
Yeah.
Negation is essential to thought. And again, you might want to bury that and say, well, it's a difference of opinion. But, the negation has a concrete meaning here, which we're not going to drag out. But the point is that it can't be reduced to, I don't want to say the contraries as in Blake, because I don't want to make this an argument about what does Blake mean, although, that is an important argument. I just mean, I got the sense with the author that, because he says this thing about contraries versus negations on the very last page of the book, and I have that feeling about, so it's now that the book is ended, all the lights are turned on, and we get to see what was the underlying thought here. And as soon as you grasp that the underlying thought is, can we have progress without negation? A lot of other features of the book came into focus for me, and some of them didn't even follow logically from that thought, and yet they seem to flow in fact quite easily. For example, if you have that attitude of avoiding those negations, and actually that's the way the book is written, so the history that is written about in the book is written in as if there weren't great social antagonisms and life and death. It's much
Let's
a level of
good. Well, let's move through that history now. You credit Whittaker with a lot of interesting history, and I agree. I mean, I found, for example, Young Husband's story, which I knew nothing about, is a brilliant story. So you might say a little bit about that. So I am gonna lead you back via Attlee into this argument about a sort of soothing history versus a sharper history, and what's missing perhaps in the book. But there's some, it is great to see, because what Whittaker's doing is he's trying to explain historically how this preface ended up being such a popular hymn. And to understand that, you've got to understand this extraordinary, colourful character who's a bit like, he reminded me a bit, although not as cravenly, as that fictional Victorian coward who. Anyway,
I know you mean.
I'll come back to it. But anyway, tell us a bit about Young Husband.
Okay, so was it Colonel? I can't remember his rank, but the committee, the Fight for Right group, that were the pro-war propaganda group that Parry wrote the music to Jerusalem for. That group was set up by this character, Young Husband, and he was both a typical Victorian adventurer. He's been called the last of the great, Victorian adventurers. He's also a proto-hippie. So, he joined, he went to Sandhurst. I think he dropped out of university. His only interest was in joining the military. And, he joined it at 18, I think. And within a few years, he was leading this expedition across the Gobi Desert with a bunch of, of his oppos with him, who were a pretty cutthroat bunch, a pretty rough bunch, moving through brigand territory, bandit territory, and ostensibly to study, the geography of the Gobi Desert, but in fact to monitor Russian troop positions on the borders near there. Is what he was doing. But he collected a huge amount of data, which did form the basis ultimately for the formation of the Royal Geographical Society, which he ended up heading. He was elected the president of some years later. But before then, he'd also been to Tibet, and he led a British invasion of Tibet, which was very bloody and massacred thousands of Tibetan soldiers. I haven't read a biography of him yet, actually. I was piecing things together, and I never really worked out whether it was because of the massacre in Tibet, which was pretty awful, frankly, and horrible. Whether it was because of that, he had qualms, and he had some kind of spiritual experience sometime after that. And as I say, I'm not sure whether it was due to the nature of the, I was going to call it a tragedy, but the massacre that he organised in Tibet. Whether that really caused his spiritual awakening, but he had a great spiritual awakening, and he ended up being an advocate quietly of free love, of the Gaia hypothesis, before it was called, long before it was called that, that the earth is a living organism. More than that, he was a pantheist, and he had some idea that the universe itself was a conscious living organism. But he also believed in things like there are secret masters of the world, which is a popular idea with people like theosophists, but he believed that the secret masters of the world were ruling the world from the planet Altair. I can't remember where he thought the planet Altair was, but he had this kind of weird set of ideas. I think, interestingly, from a modern point of view, they were also quite compatible with being militantly in favour of the Allied war effort in the First World War. So he had been a speaker founder of the World Council of Faiths, where he spoke about his conviction that all humans, all individuals are divine. But nevertheless, he went on from that to volunteer to head up the Fight for Right Society, pro-war propaganda society. So he's an absolutely fascinating character, yes. But the story that's told in the book is really about how Hubert Parry, having been asked to write the music to these stanzas that produced Jerusalem, the words by Blake had already been included in a number of poetry collections, anthologies and so on, where they had become identified with English nationalism. So they were often, but they were explicitly identified with English nationalism. So when Parry was asked to set them to music by the Fight for Right Society, that's what it was about. Take these patriotic words, make some stirring music, to cheer people up, to make them feel better about the war and about the war effort. So that's what Parry did. But the story that is told, and I think Jason Whittaker is someone who's really, I've heard him defend this idea a number of times. So I identify with him, but he puts forward this idea that Parry slowly turned against the jingoism of the Fight for Right group and turned towards the moderate, towards the suffragette movement, essentially. And although he'd written the music for Fight for Right, he eventually gave the music and the copyright to Millicent Fawcett's National Union of Women's Suffrage Societies. And in the book, this is presented as, without any specifics really, but it's presented in general as a turning away by Parry from belligerence and warmongering towards a much softened view. Now, that's okay. And, I'm sure that in the course of the war, Parry, like many people, would have become frustrated and unhappy at the amount of casualties and so on and so forth. And I'm sure he had many doubts and qualms, as many people would have, about the conduct of the war. And perhaps he found some of the more belligerent statements from some of the leadership of Fight for Right, perhaps he found them increasingly distasteful, perhaps, but I don't think that's enough for the basis of an argument that he did some sort of volte-face and he changed direction. And the evidence against it is really by looking at Millicent Fawcett, because it's simply assumed that Millicent Fawcett and her National Union of Women's Suffrage Societies represented peace and light compared to the belligerence of Fight for Right. But in fact, Millicent Fawcett had been a member of Fight for Right, at least. She had a track record. She had supported the British government in the Boer War. And she quite, reasonably supposed that if people like herself supported the government during war, that would add to the argument as to why they were responsible and should be allowed the vote after the war. So Millicent Fawcett's attitude on the outbreak of the First World War was, the first thing was that on the very first day of the war, her organisation was holding a peace rally, which is excellent. But she immediately said that, although we're for peace, that's the end of it for the war now, this rally, because we have to support the war effort, which they did in a number of ways, practically supporting the war effort, feeding soldiers on leave, all kinds of practical support. So she did that, but not only did she do that, but she said that as part of doing our bit for the war effort, we are no longer going to campaign for women's suffrage for the duration of the war. So whereas at this point, a large section of her organisation resigned. And in fact, almost all of the executive group of the National Union of Women's Suffrage Societies resigned, leaving only Fawcett and the Treasurer, leaving only two of them who remained in the pro-war position. And the rest of them went off and set up an anti-war organisation. Now, the point of that is that by the time and Parry would know all about this because his wife was friends with Millicent Fawcett. Well, this wasn't like politicking going on behind the scenes that he wouldn't be aware of. This is all in the foreground. So at the crucial point at which Parry does, in some sense, turn away from Fight for Right in order to support Millicent Fawcett and her organisation, at that point, Millicent Fawcett's organisation was a pro-war organisation that was not campaigning for women's suffrage. So my point is that, is it such a massive leap to turn this into a great dramatic sort of story, like a screenplay for a very dramatic film in which, a man looks into his heart and has a crisis of conscience and reforms and turns toward the light? No, it isn't enough to say that. Despite the fact that Parry in many ways was, he was a sort of conservative-minded member of the Liberal Party, and his friends said they weren't sure whether he was a conservative liberal or a kind of or a
liberal conservative,
radical conservative. But he was actually, Whittaker quotes one of his friends saying that you could never tell with him whether he was a conservative liberal or a liberal conservative. But actually, he doesn't tell the rest of the quote, which is that he himself, if you asked him, would say, but I am a radical. But the one thing he never shifted on was the things that he thought were of value, i.e., basically the class system of Britain. And his one thing that he was absolutely sure about was that the levelling down policy of trade unions was a disaster and made him very angry indeed. So, Parry may have changed position, but he did so within a very narrow circle of ruling opinion. With some of his friends were on the more liberal side of that. Fawcett herself, her husband had been a Liberal MP and a sort of radical one. But when in your book you have to give us signs of the radicalism of these people, that they may have attended a labour movement demonstration at some point, it is kind of fairly weak stuff, And I think that's indicative of this taming, this narrowing it down and taming of the dialectic to make this kind of slight shifting of opinion into a dramatic dialectical scene,
So Whittaker would like to see Jerusalem as a binding, conciliatory hymn, bringing the nation together in a liberal fashion, in a pro-women's rights fashion, in not such a jingoistic fashion. Your argument is no, the birth, what you've just described, the birth of the hymn very much conforms to the pro-war conservative milieu. And that's seen again in the general strike, because although the hymn does surface during the general strike, you make a really good point that it doesn't surface in the context of the strikers.
The examples we're given are of Stanley Baldwin. Well, there's a couple of examples. One is we know that the BBC at some point played Jerusalem as it was, relaying government instructions what to do during the strike. So anti-strike propaganda,
Sorry, I should say I'm talking about the general strike in 1926 in Britain.
Yeah.
But sorry, go on. So it's used sort of to rally the anti-strike.
Yeah, and then at the end of the general strike, as the workers are going back to work, the miners and their allies, Then Baldwin, the Prime Minister, um, refers to it in his speech. So come on, chaps, why don't we, if we're going, as we go back to it, why don't we go back in the spirit of Blake's Jerusalem and go back to build a future, yada yada. You can imagine the rest. That's what we know of, and they're the main examples that are given in the general strike. I did wonder, though, given this tendency to just look at pretty much what the mainstream are saying, the couple of leaders of the trade union, the Tory prime minister and so on and so forth. But what about the real radicals? Were they singing Jerusalem? And I suspect they probably were. And I suspect there were radical pacifists, actually, in the First World War. And there were radicals, proto-communists in the general strike, I imagine, who could easily have been singing Jerusalem, but we don't know. I mean, I'm not going to say that I do know, and it's a shame it's not mentioned in the book because I don't. But I kind of got the feeling that the book didn't really look into those darker corners, the real extremes of the real anti-war movement, of the pro-strike, militancy. The book doesn't tend to look into those areas at all, so you never find those things out. I mean, in particular, I wondered whether Sylvia Pankhurst, who'd broken away from a mother and sister in the other great suffragette organisation, which I've forgotten what the acronym of, but which was sort of competing with Millicent Fawcett's group, but Millicent's was much the bigger group, actually. I think by a factor of 4 or 5, it was much bigger. But the other group, the Pankhurst group, was much better known because of its militant tactics. And Sylvia had broken with her family and evolved radically to the left, was completely anti-war from the moment the war broke out, ended up founding the Workers' Socialist Federation, which was one of the constituent parties that negotiated to join the Communist Party early on, and was even browbeaten by Lenin as an ultra-leftist because she refused to join the.
You've preempted the question I was going to end on, so I'll ask it now. But I want to steer towards Attlee shortly, so don't take too long on it, right? But briefly, do you think the left should try and reclaim Jerusalem as a revolutionary anthem from proms?
I mean, I don't know is my very short answer. But one thing I'll say about it is that we have a whole book that grapples with Jerusalem, and a lot of the easiest thing to grapple with, once again, is the text. The text is there. There's some very interesting questions. Whose feet on England's green and pleasant land? What are the dark satanic mills? They're fascinating. But when you sing the hymn, I think 90% of it is the music and this tight unison singing, which gives a tremendous feeling of togetherness. Now, I can imagine singing that with, my team, with comrades or with people on the right side, but I cannot imagine it ever being a hymn that, I mean, it's a perfect national anthem because everybody.
Yeah, it really is. Yeah.
About, but in truth, it is always going to be attractive to chauvinists because of the way that this image of us all being together within as members of Albion. It's kind of Blake's figure of the primal.
Okay, good. Yeah, good answer. Now, the heart of the book in terms of the history is Attlee. And Attlee, according to your essay, is portrayed in the book as the perfect embodiment of this kind of Socratic dialectic rather than a sort of more vigorous, violent one, and a perfect example of how, at its best, Britain reconciles all interests in things like the National Health Service. And then you tear that apart. You really remind us, for those of us who'd read a bit of history and forgotten it, that Attlee was actually pretty vicious. He was an imperialist and he was anti-working class.
I think the book, the story that it tells about Attlee, is a story that you'll be familiar with if you've ever met a new member of the Labour Society at university, or a new young and enthusiastic member of the Labour Party. A key part of its identity, the left of the Labour Party, is the story of the 1945-51 Labour governments and their introduction of the NHS, there's nationalisation of some of the great industries, the welfare state, pensions, and these are all tremendous, towering changes in the life of working people. And of course, if you're a Labour left person, this is why you're in the Labour Party. You'd like to do that kind of thing. So the story that Jason Whittaker tells is very much the story from the point of view of an unproblematic Labour leftist, some kind. How wonderful all that was. But not only that, but he tells the story of how Attlee as an individual engaged with Blake, which he certainly did. He was familiar with Blake. He quotes Blake in some of the key conference speeches, I think the 1950 Labour conference speech, but also in some of his early writings when he was a councillor in London, and a radical councillor at that. He quotes from the stanzas from Jerusalem. I think he quotes the, I will not cease from mental fight, what I call the fighting stanzas,
Yeah.
So he quotes all of that. And therefore the story becomes that it is Blake who inspires Attlee, who leads the Labour Party, to deliver the welfare state. And then this becomes popular. The workers are pleased with what Attlee has done for them. And that's why Churchill and later Tory governments couldn't simply undo all of that and take away the state. So it turns ideas, Attlee's attitude to Blake, into the moving force of history, and tells this the story of unilateral success of Labour implementing Blakean ideas to create a much better world. And that's a very attractive story. But it isn't really history, because the business of the general strike of 1926, that was the end of a great wave of militancy that flooded across Britain in the wake of the First World War, the end of the First World War. And in some ways, 1926 was the end of that wave. But what that did mean is that it was very much in the minds of the British ruling class when the Second World War was ending, that they, all of these thousands and thousands of Tommies coming home, used to conflict and battle, they weren't likely to be, they weren't going to be happy putting up with the conditions that their families had to live in before the war. Something had to be done. Not only that, but everybody also knew that, to create the new modern economy that they need to create to rebuild after the end of the war, not just in Britain, but across Europe, it was clearly going to be a different kind of economy. And it actually required levels of health and literacy that hadn't been required before. So many of these changes were necessary for capital. And that is why many of them were designed by the Liberal Party, by Beveridge, the Liberal economist, who in the Beveridge report from before the time of the Labour government had designed many of these changes. So it wasn't simply a matter of Blake inspiring Attlee, pulling all this stuff out of his hat, out of his head. These demands were on the table. At the root of it was the pressure from workers, the threat of worker militancy, and also the needs of the economy. And so that puts a completely different spin on the economic changes. But then you have to know also that Attlee wasn't operating in a complete vacuum, that he responded to the pressures around him. And so whereas Whittaker points out correctly that effectively Attlee oversaw the most significant phase of the dismantling of the British Empire, which is true. But he quotes Blake saying, "Empire is no more." Inadvertently, Attlee has taken to this place where empire is no more, which is not what happened.
No.
There were not only were there the independent movements demanding, a winding down of the British Empire, as if it was all the fault of the British that dismantled the empire. But there was the fact that Attlee needed to replace it with a different imperialism. He recognised that British imperialism was on its last legs. So he aligned with American imperialism very, very explicitly. That is where the future of Britain lay, according to him. And that's why we talk about the special relationship with America today. He designed that relationship, which means that he followed America into Korea, for example. The idea that he was a pacifist, he had the British troops in Malaya. He supported the putting down of the anti-fascist communist forces in Greece. As a result of Yalta, that was carved out into Western territory. So the West had to disarm the communists, basically, who had been the anti-fascists. But he was part of that. He was part of the putting down of the Malaya uprising. He was part for Korea. He reintroduced conscription. And when the generals weren't happy with his plan for conscription, they threatened to revolt. And so he gave them what they wanted, which was 18 months, which he later upped even further to support the war in Korea. So he was no anti-imperialist, and he was no pacifist. He had, in fact, was explicitly not a pacifist. His brother had been a pacifist and had been imprisoned in World War I while Attlee volunteered. So I'm not saying, that being a pacifist is the measure of your Blakeanism for reasons I gave earlier. But unless you understand that, you get a very distorted picture of Attlee as a source of light with no downside, and also as a sort of primum mobile of history, that the ideas of Blake inspired Attlee to do things. It's just a very unhistorical way of seeing that process. But what it does allow you to do is have a dialectic that is kind of not antagonistic again. Good ideas. There's some disagreements. Some people wanted to go a little bit further than others. But there is. So you get that presented as the great struggle. Attlee struggling against the slightly more conservative members of the Labour Party. That's the dialectic you're offered. You never get to meet the Tommies coming home from the war, or striking coalmen, or miners unhappy at the way that the mine owners were recompensed under nationalisation. You never get to hear those other voices at all. So I see it as another example, as with the telling of the story of Parry and Younghusband and Fawcett, another example of telling history in this dampened, muted fashion, and excluding the real extremes and the real contradictions in order to tell a much neater, easier and tidier story, but it isn't the right.
And that's almost a concluding note between the difference between your take and Whittaker's take, except that I'd like to just go into one more area, which is popular culture versus counterculture, because it seems to me that the book takes a sort of cherry picking anyone who's mentioned Blake who's also a celebrity is a good thing, and it seems to have missed the fact that the radical counterculture really connected to Blake from the I'm talking about the late 60s, and you talk about Ginsberg's visit to the UK, and that this should have been really important to understanding the historical co-option of Blake by the left rather than the conservative co-option of him, but it's absent.
I think the problem that the book suffers from is that if you want to tell this muted story of these tiny little things but blown up as if they were great struggles, Barry's crisis of conscience, all of those kind of things, the problem you've got is that overwhelmingly, when people sing Jerusalem, they are singing a nationalist song. There is a kind of problematic nature to it. So where is your story? Well, of course, there are versions of it that aren't like that, where it is contested. So, he offers the very, very good example of Mark Stewart and the Mafia's version of Jerusalem, which is extremely aggressive, kind of industrial. It's actually played by a reggae band, but a kind of industrial sounding thing, massive percussion, lots of use of, I think, cassettes played through echo units of samples of the Parry music, but used as samples, bursting through echo units and things like that. So it's a completely different take on it, affectively, and that's great. So that story is there, but the problem is there's a much wider story, and at points I did wonder, have I missed the point of this book? Is there something about the brief of this book that means that certain things have been excluded? So for example, the thing, as you mentioned, that I thought was really peculiar by its absence was really the counterculture is missing. And you can all haggle about what is exactly meant by the term counterculture. But if we just narrow it down to what I think we can all agree is the counterculture of the 60s and the beats, I think Aldous Huxley, the beats going on to Ginsberg, Dylan, that kind of counterculture, narrow it down to even to just that is completely missing. You might say that in a book about the English reception of a hymn about England, maybe Americans like Ginsberg and whatever, and the Beach generally, and William Burroughs and Bob Dylan are extraneous to that, and the counterculture, the hippies are from San Francisco. Maybe they aren't part of this story, but of course they are, because, the reception of Blake in England didn't just take place, isn't a purely English affair. And we were massively, obviously affected by those things. An entire generation that turned towards the new left, turned towards the counterculture, absorbed a completely different idea of Blake. And if that's not reflected in enough versions of Jerusalem, well, nevertheless, you still have to grapple with this seismic change in the perception of Blake. And I found that it was just missing. So, Ginsberg is literally mentioned in passing, and I tried to bring in, because of the point I just made about the beats and the counterculture perhaps being a rather American thing, I tried to bring in the English franchise, people like Ian Sinclair, who filmed and documented Ginsberg's great visits to the Dialectics of Liberation conference, his visits to England, stuff like that, as all documented by Sinclair, who remains very much, I don't know, someone in the spirit or wake of Blake or something like that. Sinclair is only mentioned. I think he's mentioned saying that Blake was a psychogeographer, and I think he's mentioned saying that Sadie Smith, the author, writes in a psychogeographical way, something like that. But there's nothing about the work of any of the English, never mind the counterculture, any of the English poets who were influenced massively by Blake. People like David Gascoigne and George Barker, they're not in the book at all. Ginsberg, Sinclair, people like that, not in the book. So you just feel the absence of the counterculture. Again, I assume at some point, Jason might reply to my criticism and say, well, I couldn't write about that because my brief was X, Y, and Z. And that'll be interesting. But whatever is the case about that, it gives a very distorting view of the period if you don't talk about that. And the other thing, I don't know if you were going to mention separately, that's very much noticeable by its absence, is really the Communist Party. Now, not that I'm a fan of them, but, Whittaker says that, for example, he says, because of the rise of National Socialism, the Nazis, National Socialism, you see, many people on the left were scared of turning towards nationalism because the combination of nationalism and socialism was basically getting bad press because of Hitler, something like that. Well, what about the Popular Front? What about the biggest turn, the collapse of the communist movement into becoming a nationalist in every country, telling the communists to ally with sections of the ruling class under a national banner of anti-fascism? There are so many ironies here that are beautiful. One of them is that the members of the Communist Party in Britain who got the message from Stalin, research your own radical history instead of going on about Bolshevism all the time, quoting Lenin. That's what created the Communist Party Historians Group, who did all the research on the ranters, the English Civil War, antinomians, the levelers, the world turned upside down, the making of the English working classes. That's all because of the turn of communists to nationalism. And they didn't create Blake's studies, but all the great, E.P. Thompson's Witness to the Beast, his brilliant book on Blake. All of these things emerge from the engagement of the Communist Party with nationalism, which was a disastrous policy politically, but but it has all these ramifications, and nobody can say that it doesn't influence our perception of Blake, because I think it influences Professor Whittaker's perception, because it was the Communist Party who eventually produced the British Road to Socialism and argued that the entire nation can get together in the Labour Party and recreate the welfare state. I mean, basically, the perspective he offers is essentially the perspective of the Communist Party in the Popular Front. That's what it is. And so to really miss all of that out, it just seems to me to greatly distort the understanding we have of Blake's relation to nationalism, one, but of the perception of Blake and the question of nationalism as it relates to radicalism in this country.
Brilliant, brilliant. Well, that's a really, really good critique of the book, to be honest. But I think I think that I'm very persuaded. Perhaps just as a sort of final thought, where does that leave you when you read Jerusalem? Yeah.
Well, notice you asked me when I read Jerusalem. Reading the stanzas that are woven into Jerusalem is not the same as singing it. And singing
absolutely not.
Yeah. Singing it at the proms. Okay. So if you ask me, can I imagine circumstances in which I would recommend that an organisation I was in adopt Jerusalem as its hymn? I can't, because I think there's always this sort of back door within it open to chauvinism. What does that mean about people who are singing it? I don't know. It does literally means completely different things to different people. But I think what we have established is that, these things are projections onto what Blake wrote. What Blake himself wrote can be much debated about, but there's no evidence that's easy to understand, or that it's what people read into that hymn. We can debate that. But the fact is that whatever Blake himself meant, I think this hymn is always going to be somewhat problematic, which is strange. Because fundamentally you have to say, are you glad that people are singing it? Because it's a chance for you to go and say, well, actually what Blake meant, and I'm not, because
no.
Yeah, because I think it's feeding into something. And I would rather say that I would rather fundamentally think of it as a misuse of Blake, because the alternative, which is what is argued in the book, is that because we can all sing it, it can unite us all. But it can only unite us all as we all pretend that we mean the same thing. The chauvinist and the radical. Do we mean the same thing by this? As soon as you ask that question, you've got an argument, and not necessarily a non-negation type argument. You might have a really stiff argument there. You might be talking with a racist or a xenophobe who's literally, I've seen, and again, Whittaker quotes it, militant, racist, pro-Enoch Powell Brexit supporters quoting Blake on Jerusalem and England's green and pleasant land. So, that is too big a contradiction to overcome with an argument about, the hermeneutics of Blake or something like that, interpretation of Blake. I mean, we have to take the political view. And in the political view, no, I don't think it's really something.
But as a work of art that you're reading, I think it's different. I think it's really powerful, and it still resonates today. For example, if it was discussing love, so if Jerusalem was not the polity of Britain, but if Jerusalem was the most beautiful place you can imagine, then there's something in the structure of that poem where it moves from heaven to darkness to let's you and me. You could be talking to your lover, and you could be saying to your lover, let's fight for our love, and that dynamic in the poem still works. So I think Blake, you know more than me about Blake, but I think that's more in the spirit of Blake. I think his Jerusalem was something more universal than England, and I think his fighting spirit was something more universal than the English. And I think that you could still read that poem and take a lot from it as a work of art without.
Well, you see,
Yeah.
You keep saying read the poem, but actually we're talking about a hymn. And if you don't sing it, and if there's no tune, it's a very, very different thing. And I would say a lot of the problematic side of the thing is to do with the music and this unison thing that it does. And that it's beautifully, it's very persuasively done.
Yeah.
It's no coincidence that Parry, who was the sort of head of the Royal School of Music or whatever, it's no coincidence that he was a great student of English folk music and studied folk styles. And his use of the sort of unison type structures, unison singing, which was a popular thing to do at that time. But its deployment of it is what creates this amazingly, this emotional pull and that sense of togetherness and hope and so on and so forth. But they're artifacts of the music. I don't think that the music is necessarily an interpretation of Blake. Blake himself is always a much slipperier character and much harder to pin down. And I think that one thing I would say about it is that, and I'm mentioning it now because I realised that I didn't mention it in the essay, is that the whole business of seeing Christ in England without being physically in England, he can be really here without being physically here. That's the kind of statement that obviously upsets a materialist, but it wouldn't upset Blake. But I think there are elements of that even in the fighting stanzas, bring me my spear and all that, because I think my chariot of fire has an element of the of Jewish mysticism to it, sort of macabre mysticism, which is the mysticism of seeing God face to face.
I thought it was Apollonic. So the god, it's Apollo flying through the skies with his burning chariot.
Well, maybe, but and there are certainly elements of that because it's a fiery chariot through the sky. So there you've got, your solar deities and, the whole history of paganism there. But also in terms of macabre mysticism, one of the things about the chariot of fire is that this chariot is where God was seen at some point. It was God in the chariot, whom was it Elijah sees God, doesn't he? I can't remember my theology falling apart in public. But the point is that in macabre mysticism, a strand of Jewish mysticism, this is a famous moment because it's one of the few times that man actually meets God. And it's associated with the macabre, this fiery chariot. My point is that whereas, as we discussed earlier, what I call the fighting stanzas have this a sort of different emotional intensity.
Yeah.
The thing, it all does connect up with this different way of seeing the presence of God. Were those feet in ancient times? Did they walk on England's green and pleasant land? It's commensurate with the idea of meeting God face to face.
Yeah.
But none of that is present when people sing the modern Jewish.
No.
So the
No, but for me, the poem steps up a gear. So it's idyllic, and then it steps up into the need to launch oneself into battle, mental strife, and so on. But when you're doing that, you yourself become incandescent with one of those Blake-like images, with the sun pouring out of you. That's how it feels to me, that he wants us to
it's very solar. Well, as Yeats and Ellis said in an early.
Yeah, and I didn't bring this up, but you defend Yeats against Whittaker in a really interesting way. I don't know. We should really be concluding, right? We've been going on too long, but maybe just say a little bit about this because I loved that.
I think Whittaker does the defence himself without knowing it. He says so. Yates and Ellis, who wrote an early 2-volume analysis of Blake with lots of his texts, was very, very, very early on. It was only like the second major thing about Blake published. But they analyse the words of the stanzas, and the fighting bit they analyse as sort of male sexual energy. So the spear aloft and so on. And so they see it in those terms. And Whittaker dismisses this in a very offhand way. And he puts it down to Yeats's well-known, dalliance with the occult. But then he says, but nevertheless, it's remarkably insightful because, of course, it's about the sexual imagery, which absolutely saturates everything in Blake. So in other words, they're right, you know. And I thought it was a missed opportunity, really, to see, instead of interpreting the whole of the stanzas in terms of the pseudo dialectic between, is it reactionary and progressive, how reactionary, how militaristic, how pacifistic is it, you know, is it with this sort of, that sort of thing. There's this whole aspect to the sexual energy, you know, and the thing that attracts you there is a kind of sexual energy, Colin, the solar thing, you know, which would be in the Golden Dawn. That solar thing would be very much
no, I'm very well aware I'm imposing myself on the poem, but that's what people do
that way. But what I'm saying is that there's more within the poem.
And I'm agreeing with you. In some ways it's a very pagan poem, even though it's, you know, those feet in ancient times is Christian. The other aspects to it are very pagan, and just the whole spirit of it is, you know, I could.
You know, it has a kind of martial spirit to it.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
So it's like, you know, it decries corporeal war quite correctly. You know, bloodlust, sadism, war crimes. You know, crazy kings who launch 30-year wars, and you know, and so all this kind of thing. He denounces all of that, but he does it from a kind of a martial point of view. You know, bring me my sword. You know, you know, I'm against the silly slaves of the sword. Pass me my sword, and it's very difficult to argue in the middle of that kind of fighting stanza with all of that martial confrontational energy, to say, well, that sword, it must have been an intellectual sword, because, you know, it doesn't come across like that if we're going to take text seriously. So I think, so the aspect of the sexual bit to it is as valid as the kind of ideological thing about progress. Are you pacifistic or not? And I think it's an important lens through which to read the thing, because then I think, you know, you would see the singing of the hymn in a very different way. I think very hard, you know, it's
you would see the singing of the hymn as a castration.
It
castrates the poem.
It does, yes. And so that's why I thought that, you know, again, Whittaker, it's Whittaker who makes the point. This is extremely insightful, because he is a Blake scholar, and he understands that the sexual thing is always there in Blake, you know, pretty much always. And this is a powerful structuring, because he didn't palm sex off from spirituality and see them as two unrelated matters, because he brought them together. They are often together there in his poetry. So to make the point, you know, I mean, he's right about Yeats and the Golden Dawn. You know, he was obsessed with it. That's all fine. But to use that to dismiss that insight, I think it's a mistake from the point of view of the book, because it would have added another day.
Good. Well, that's covered all the main takeaways I had, but there's lots more in your essay. It's a fantastic essay. It's what, 22,000 words. So I think for fans of Blake, or people interested in the reception of Jerusalem, obviously, you know, read Whittaker's book, but also I think your critique is really valid as well.
Well, thanks for, you know, leading this discussion. You know, I would say, you know, to anyone watching, that the point of my critique is to try and re-establish this idea of a countercultural Blake that is at odds with the last. So I was going to say the latest books on Blake, but what I really mean is Jason Whittaker's book on Jerusalem and John Hicks's book on William Blake versus the world, because they're both going to be they're both popularly received. They both have some impact on you know, how Blake is perceived, and I think they're both wrong in pretty much the same way, and in the way they defanged Blake. And that's what I tried to describe in my essay, just to set up the countercultural Blake as the alternative to that. And I realised that I haven't answered most of the questions that raises, but my essay is an attempt just to establish that distinction as a framework for future discussion.
Brilliant.